The padlock is warm from the sun, not hot, just warm enough that you feel it through the ridges of cheap brass, like the island itself has been holding it in its mouth all afternoon. There's dust on the shackle where somebody tried to worry it loose. Dust and a faint smear of rust, the color of old blood left too long on a blade. The gate stands there in the wind, a simple thing. A ranch gate you'd see anywhere west of the Rockies. Pipe and chain and a sag that tells you no one plans to replace it. Beyond it, the road runs straight for a ways and then begins to undulate, slipping through kiawe and low scrub, past rock walls piled by hands that never signed anything, toward pasture land that looks from a distance like peace. But it is not peace. It is quiet. And quiet is what you get when people learn that shouting doesn't move a man with a deed in his pocket. The air smells like salt and dry grass and sunburnt iron. Somewhere out there downwind, cattle have been standing in their own heat, and that sweet, sour animal stink rides the breeze like a memory. You hear the gate chain clink once, twice, as if the island is testing it. There is no music here, no ukulele romance. The ocean is close enough that you can taste it, but not close enough to be seen, hidden behind folds of land. A mynah bird scolds. A truck passes far off, one of those old ranch trucks that never dies, the body rattling over potholes like bones in a sack. And then nothing. The kind of nothing that makes your own breathing sound like trespass. They will tell you Molokai is the friendly isle. They will say it like it's a brand, like it's a promise you can buy. They will tell you this ranch was a blessing, jobs, stability, a big employer in a place with few options. They'll tell you that a private company held the land the way a shepherd holds a flock, keeping the wolves out. They'll tell you the island was sleepy until money woke it up, and that waking up is always good. But the truth is colder and it's older. The truth is a ledger. The truth is ink. The truth is a line drawn across a map by someone who will never step barefoot on the soil. A ranch is not just cattle. A ranch is water rights and fencing and access roads, and who gets to cross a shoreline without being watched. A ranch is the power to say yes in the morning and no in the afternoon, and to make both answers sound like benevolence. And Molokai, this long, wind-scoured piece of land sitting in the channel like a stone thrown from the fist of a god, Molokai remembers things. It remembers who was taken here and kept here. It remembers the sound of oars and the sound of crying and the sound of doors locking behind people who were told it was for the greater good. It remembers what happens when outsiders arrive with plans and patience and a vocabulary made of development and progress and community benefit, words that can be made to mean anything if you say them slowly enough. On the mainland, you can drive for hours and believe land is endless. Out here, the land ends. It ends in cliff and reef and foam. It ends in a straight drop where the wind comes up hard and sudden and tries to peel you off the edge like bark from a dead tree. On an island, ownership is not abstract. Ownership is a gate. Ownership is a locked chain across a road that used to be open. Ownership is a man in an office on Oahu or in California deciding if you can hold a wedding on a beach your grandmother walked as a girl. Ownership is a brochure describing your home as untouched. They say Molokai Ranch was cursed. They say it with that half-smile people wear when they want mystery without consequence. They'll mention bad luck, investors who came and went, grand plans that collapsed, deals that soured, promises that burned off like morning fog. They'll whisper about the land itself, rejecting ambition, as if the soil has a spirit that punishes greed. It makes for a fine story, a curse, a little supernatural garnish to make the bitter medicine go down. But the curse was never magic. The curse was arithmetic. You can see it in the way the pastures were measured, in acres, tens of thousands of acres held under one name, one corporation, one signature at the bottom of a page. You can see it in the way cattle become numbers, head counts, weights, market prices per pound, the cost of hay shipped in when the rain doesn't come. You can see it in the way an island gets treated like a portfolio. Ranching revenue, tourism potential, real estate upside, highest and best use. You can see it in the way the word local gets used like seasoning, sprinkled on brochures, used to sell authenticity to strangers, while the locals themselves are asked to accept wages that don't match the cost of living in paradise. A ranch has a rhythm. Dawn work, dust, sweat, animals that don't care what your plan was, and a ranch can be a kind of honesty. It can. It can teach you humility, because the weather does not negotiate. But a ranch can also be a mask, a wide-brim hat pulled low over the eyes of a corporation. A story told to soften the fact that a handful of people control access to what many consider sacred. Molokai Ranch sat at that intersection, between the romance of ranch country and the brutal modern machinery of capital, between Paniolo tradition and boardroom math, between an island's hunger for work and an island's fear of being sold off piece by piece until there's nothing left but the name. And the thing about islands is this: you can only push so far before you meet the sea. There is no westward escape. There is no new frontier. There is only what you have and who you are willing to become to keep it. So a gate becomes a battleground. A meeting becomes a war. A permit becomes a moral question. A dollar amount becomes a verdict. And the people who are supposed to be quiet, who are supposed to smile for visitors, who are supposed to accept whatever development dripped down from distant owners, those people begin to do something that makes investors nervous and lawyers busy. They begin to say no, not loudly at first, just steadily, the way you say no when you've been saying yes for 100 years and it never saved you. And then the ranch learns what every empire learns eventually. Land can be bought, but legitimacy must be earned. This is not simply the story of a ranch that rose and fell. It is the story of an island forced to decide whether it would be fed by outside money or devoured by it, whether progress meant survival or surrender, whether the American idea of private property could coexist with an older idea that land is not a commodity at all, but a relative, a duty, a graveyard, a future. Was Molokai Ranch a lifeline for a forgotten place? Or was it a slow occupation dressed in aloha and investment language? All right, Russ Daniels here. I've been digging through records and old reporting and trying to build this into a steady cadence because I want to make this kind of ranch country storytelling my full-time work. So if you'll subscribe as a little pact between us. It don't cost a thing. And tell me straight, what brought you here? Do you love ranches or something? They say it started with a handshake. They say it started with a lucky card. Some Honolulu man in a linen suit winning half an island the way a drunk wins a watch. They say Molokai Ranch was born the way legends are born. A clean moment, a single decision, a brave wager, a bold vision. But the truth is not clean. The truth is layered like old lava. The truth begins long before any ranch ever had a name. Begins in the legal surgery of the great Mahele in 1848, when land that had been held by relationship and obligation was cut into categories and titles and paper. The kind of paper that can outlive a family, the kind of paper that can forget a song. And once land becomes paper, it becomes portable. It can be carried in a briefcase across an ocean. It can be signed away in a room where no one smells the dust. Molokai is not a postcard. Molokai is a blade of earth set in water, about 260 square miles, roughly 109,000 acres. If you do the old American conversion, the kind that turns a living place into a number you can circle. 3 volcanoes stitched together by time, with a backbone of high, wet mountains on the east end and a long, dry west end that squints into the sun and survives on stubbornness. The wind does not negotiate here. The rain plays favorites. The central plain, the Ho'olehua Gap, can look rich from above and still kill crops with a slow, saline thirst. In the mid-19th century, the West End was already cattle country. Not Hollywood cattle country, real cattle country, thorn and rock and heat, and the long work of keeping animals alive where grass grows mean. The land that would become the ranch had passed through royal hands. Lot Kapuaiwa, who would become King Kamehameha V in 1863, held title to lands on the West End and expanded his holdings. He saw what a dry island could be made to do if you treated it like a machine, livestock, grazing, enterprise. When he died, the land passed to Princess Ruth Ke'elikalani, and when she died in 1883, much of it flowed into the inheritance of Bernice Pawahi Bishop, the last direct descendant of the Kamehameha line. Her estate, what people call Bishop Estate, would become one of the great engines of landholding in Hawaii. A trust, a board, a legal creature designed to endure. And this is where the myth tries to sneak in and make it simple. A princess, an inheritance, a clean transfer. But history is never a clean transfer. History is a pressure system. By the time the 1890s arrive, Hawaii is already being pulled apart by forces that don't speak Hawaiian. The monarchy has been overthrown in 1893. Annexation is in the air. Like smoke you can't quite see, but you can taste it. Foreign ownership is no longer an exception. It is becoming the rule. The laws have been bent for decades to make private land alienable, purchasable, collateralizable. Land is now something you can leverage. So when a group of Honolulu businessmen sit down in 1897 and talk about Molokai, they are not talking about an island the way a fisherman talks about a shoreline. They are talking the way men talk about timber, about coal, about acreage and yield and access. The names matter because this is not a fairy tale. This is administration. Judge Alfred S. Hartwell, Alfred W. Carter, A.D. McClellan, men with reputations built in offices and courtrooms, men who understood that the right clause in the right document could move more earth than 1,000 shovels. They form a hui, a group, and they buy approximately 70,000 acres in fee simple from the trustees of Pawahi's estate. Not a lease, not a handshake, a purchase you can record. Then they lease an additional 30,000 acres from the government. Now they are staring at a number that sounds like conquest. 100,000 acres, a private dominion on a public island. And you can picture the room where this happens. Honolulu, warm and close, the air heavy with humidity and cigar smoke, a table polished so well it reflects the hands hovering over the papers, the scratch of pen on paper, a sound so small you'd miss it if you weren't listening for it, and yet that scratch is the hinge of a century, ink drying, a blotter pressed down, a seal. Somewhere, a clerk watching the signatures like a priest watching a confession, making sure the ritual is properly performed. Was it enterprise? Or was it extraction with better manners? Out on Molokai, the land itself does not change because a document changes. The kiawe still claws. The sun still leans on your neck like a hand. The cattle still need water. But ownership changes everything that matters to people. Who can cross where, who can graze where, who is suddenly called a trespasser on ground they have always known. At the turn of the century, Molokai is still sparsely populated by American standards. A federal census in 1900 will count about 2,400 people on the island, and more than 1,000 of them are at the leprosy settlement on the North Shore, a human quarantine established in the 1860s, a separate tragedy crouched behind the ranch story like a shadow. In 1897, the assessed value of the entire island is around $250,000. By 1900, with sugar dreams inflating like a sail, it jumps to about $680,000, value conjured on paper by plans not yet proven. Then the plans falter, and the value sinks again. The island is learning early how outside money changes the numbers first and the lives later. Because the businessmen are not satisfied with cattle. Cattle are slow. Cattle are honest in a way that makes financiers nervous. Sugar is the fever of that era, the great engine, the thing that can turn land into export dollars fast enough to intoxicate a boardroom. So in 1898, they incorporate the American Sugar Company Limited, tied closely to the ranch company, and they set their sights on the Central Plain. But sugar does not grow on confidence. Sugar grows on water. And Molokai, for all its green cliffs on the east end, guards its fresh water like a miser. Still they try. Of course they try. There is a date that sits in the record like a nail. February 2nd, 1898, a sale closing, a formal transfer to the new ranch company, the kind of administrative moment that feels, to the men involved, like a beginning. They are eager enough that within weeks they are hiring drillers. They hire the McCandless brothers to bore test wells at Molokai. And on April 22nd, 1898, a steamer called the Helene comes in, Wilder steamship, coal smoke and salt spray, bringing a crew and a complete artesian well-boring outfit. Steel and steam and ambition rolled up in crates and rope. You can smell that arrival. Hot machinery exposed to sea air, wet rope, diesel and coal. Men sweating in the sun as they haul iron inland 3/4 of a mile up Molokai Gulch from the ocean. The equipment thuds onto ground that has never agreed to this bargain. They set up the rig like it's a church. They begin to drill. 2 wells about 40 feet apart, drilled down 80 to 90 feet, lined with an 8-inch casing. By July, they're complete. The water is pumped and used to irrigate 80 acres of seed cane planted on the flats below. Seed cane, the beginning of a plantation that exists first as intention. The deeper well turns brackish when pumped for 2 days and is abandoned. The shallower one holds longer, pumped at around 1 million gallons a day for over a year without salinity creeping upward. For a brief moment, the dream seems to have a pulse. Then the island begins to teach them what it always teaches. You don't take what isn't offered without paying a price. In 1899, they hire a geohydrologist from San Francisco, Michael M. O'Shaughnessy, a professional brought in to give science to the fever. A Worthington steam-driven pump is ordered, installed, and used to lift water from a battery of wells to fields that are expanding faster than the water can support. Hundreds of acres planted, thousands more prepared. And then the wells begin to fail. 5 go dry. Salinity readings swing like a compass near iron. A flash flood caves in pump wells. Equipment is dug out, removed, reinstalled. The main shaft's integrity is damaged. Salt water seeps in. Leaks are patched, others cannot be found. The more they pump, the more the ocean presses back. By May 29, 1900, O'Shaughnessy is writing correspondence condemning the reckless layout, warning that the wells are drawing straight from the sea. The language is technical, but the meaning is ancient. You cannot cheat the island. The island keeps accounts. So the legend of a ranch born from bravado, born from a clean deal, dies right there in the brackish water. What is born instead is the real thing, a vast holding held together by contracts and drought and debt, and the quiet labor of men who wake before dawn to do work that will never be romantic on paper. Was it a beginning? Or was it the first mistake written large enough that the whole island would have to live with it? Either way, the signature has dried. The pump is running. The cane is planted. And Molokai, patient, unsentimental, waits to see what kind of people these new owners will become when the water turns to salt. They say it started with a handshake. They say it started with a lucky card. Some Honolulu man in a linen suit winning half an island the way a drunk wins a watch. They say Molokai Ranch was born the way legends are born. A clean moment, a single decision, a brave wager, a bold vision. But the truth is not clean. The truth is layered like old lava. The truth begins long before any ranch ever had a name. Begins in the legal surgery of the great Mahala in 1848, when land that had been held by relationship and obligation was cut into categories and titles and paper. The kind of paper that can outlive a family, the kind of paper that can forget a song, and once land becomes paper, it becomes portable. It can be carried in a briefcase across an ocean. It can be signed away in a room where no one smells the dust. Molokai is not a postcard. Molokai is a blade of earth set in water, about 260 square miles, roughly 106,000 acres. If you do the old American conversion, the kind that turns a living place into a number you can circle. 3 volcanoes stitched together by time, with a backbone of high, wet mountains on the east end and a long, dry west end that squints into the sun and survives on stubbornness. The wind does not negotiate here. The rain plays favorites. The central plain, the Ho'olahoa Gap, can look rich from above and still kill crops with a slow, saline thirst. In the mid-19th century, the West End was already cattle country, not Hollywood cattle country, real cattle country, thorn and rock and heat and the long work of keeping animals alive where grass grows mean. The land that would become the ranch had passed through royal hands. Lot Kapawaiwa, who would become King Kamehameha V in 1863, held title to lands on the West End and expanded his holdings. He saw what a dry island could be made to do if you treated it like a machine. Livestock, grazing, enterprise. When he died, the land passed to Princess Ruth Ke'elikalani, and when she died in 1883, much of it flowed into the inheritance of Bernice Pauahi Bishop, the last direct descendant of the Kamehameha line. Her estate, what people call Bishop Estate, would become one of the great engines of landholding in Hawaii, a trust, a board, a legal creature designed to endure. And this is where the myth tries to sneak in and make it simple: a princess, an inheritance, a clean transfer. But history is never a clean transfer. History is a pressure system. By the time the 1890s arrive, Hawaii is already being pulled apart by forces that don't speak Hawaiian. The monarchy has been overthrown in 1893. Annexation is in the air, like smoke you can't quite see, but you can taste it. Foreign ownership is no longer an exception. It is becoming the rule. The laws have been bent for decades to make private land alienable, purchasable, collateralizable. Land is now something you can leverage. So when a group of Honolulu businessmen sit down in 1897 and talk about Molokai, they are not talking about an island the way a fisherman talks about a shoreline. They are talking the way men talk about timber, about coal, about acreage and yield and access. The names matter because this is not a fairy tale. This is administration. Judge Alfred S. Hartwell, Alfred W. Carter, A.D. McClellan, men with reputations built in offices and courtrooms, men who understood that the right clause in the right document could move more earth than 1,000 shovels. They form a huai, a group, and they buy approximately 70,000 acres in fee simple from the trustees of Pauahi's estate. Not a lease, not a handshake. A purchase you can record. Then they lease an additional 30,000 acres from the government. Now they are staring at a number that sounds like conquest: 100,000 acres, a private dominion on a public island. And you can picture the room where this happens. Honolulu, warm and close, the air heavy with humidity and cigar smoke, a table polished so well it reflects the hands hovering over the papers. The scratch of pen on paper, a sound so small you'd miss it if you weren't listening for it, and yet that scratch is the hinge of a century. Ink drying, a blotter pressed down, a seal. Somewhere, a clerk watching the signatures like a priest watching a confession, making sure the ritual is properly performed. Was it enterprise? Or was it extraction with better manners? Out on Molokai, the land itself does not change because a document changes. The kiawe still claws. The sun still leans on your neck like a hand. The cattle still need water. But ownership changes everything that matters to people. Who can cross where, who can graze where, who is suddenly called a trespasser on ground they have always known. At the turn of the century, Molokai is still sparsely populated by American standards. A federal census in 1900 will count about 2,400 people on the island, and more than 1,000 of them are at the leprosy settlement on the North Shore, a human quarantine established in the 1860s, a separate tragedy crouched behind the ranch story like a shadow. In 1897, the assessed value of the entire island is around $250,000. By 1900, with sugar dreams inflating like a sail, it jumps to about $680,000, value conjured on paper by plans not yet proven. Then the plans falter, and the value sinks again. The island is learning early how outside money changes the numbers first and the lives later. Because the businessmen are not satisfied with cattle. Cattle are slow. Cattle are honest in a way that makes financiers nervous. Sugar is the fever of that era, the great engine, the thing that can turn land into export dollars fast enough to intoxicate a boardroom. So in 1898, they incorporate the American Sugar Company Limited, tied closely to the ranch company, and they set their sights on the Central Plain. But sugar does not grow on confidence. Sugar grows on water, and Molokai, for all its green cliffs on the east end, guards its fresh water like a miser. Still, they try. Of course they try. There is a date that sits in the record like a nail. February 1998. A sale closing, a formal transfer to the new ranch company, the kind of administrative moment that feels to the men involved like a beginning. They are eager enough that within weeks they are hiring drillers. They hire the McCandless brothers to bore test wells at Molokai. And on April 22nd, 1898, a steamer called the Helene comes in. Wild as steamship, coal smoke and salt spray, bringing a crew and a complete artesian well-boring outfit. Steel and steam and ambition rolled up in crates and rope. You can smell that arrival. Hot machinery exposed to sea air, wet rope, diesel and coal. Men sweating in the sun as they haul iron inland, 3/4 of a mile up Molokai Gulch from the ocean. The equipment thuds onto ground that has never agreed to this bargain. They set up the rig like it's a church. They begin to drill. 2 wells about 40 feet apart, drilled down 80 to 90 feet, lined with an 8-inch casing. By July, they're complete. The water is pumped and used to irrigate 80 acres of seed cane planted on the flats below. Seed cane, the beginning of a plantation that exists first as intention. The deeper well turns brackish when pumped for 2 days and is abandoned. The shallower one holds longer, pumped at around 1 million gallons a day for over a year without salinity creeping upward. For a brief moment, the dream seems to have a pulse. Then the island begins to teach them what it always teaches. You don't take what isn't offered without paying a price. In 1899, they hire a geohydrologist from San Francisco, Michael M. O'Shaughnessy, a professional brought in to give science to the fever. A Worthington steam-driven pump is ordered, installed, and used to lift water from a battery of wells to fields that are expanding faster than the water can support. Hundreds of acres planted, thousands more prepared, and then the wells begin to fail. 5 go dry. Salinity readings swing like a compass near iron. A flash flood caves in pump wells. Equipment is dug out, removed, reinstalled. The main shaft's integrity is damaged. Salt water seeps in, leaks are patched, others cannot be found. The more they pump, the more the ocean presses back. By May 29, 1900, O'Shaughnessy is writing correspondence condemning the reckless layout, warning that the wells are drawing straight from the sea. The language is technical, but the meaning is ancient. You cannot cheat the island. The island keeps accounts. So the legend of a ranch born from bravado, born from a clean deal, dies right there in the brackish water. What is born instead is the real thing, a vast holding held together by contracts and drought and debt and the quiet labor of men who wake before dawn to do work that will never be romantic on paper. Was it a beginning? Or was it the first mistake written large enough that the whole island would have to live with it? Either way, the signature has dried. The pump is running, the cane is planted, and Molokai, patient, unsentimental, waits to see what kind of people these new owners will become when the water turns to salt. They'll tell you a ranch is simple: cattle, grass, men on horseback moving through wide light like it belongs to them. They'll tell you the work is honest because it is hard, because it breaks your hands and cracks your lips and leaves you smelling of sweat and animal hide. They'll tell you the ranch is a living thing, breathing, grazing, enduring, but the truth of a ranch that size is colder. At a certain scale, a ranch stops being a place and becomes an instrument, a counting house with fences, a business that just happens to have dust in its teeth. You can feel the shift the moment you walk into the office, before you ever step into pasture. The air changes, it goes still. Paper replaces weather. The sound becomes not wind in ironwood, but pencil on ledger. It's early morning on the West End, and the light comes hard and flat off the plain, the sun already climbing as if late for something. A man sits at a desk with a fan that does more noise than work. His sleeves are rolled. Ink stains the webbing between thumb and forefinger. He opens the book, heavy, bound, smelling faintly of glue and mildew, and the island becomes columns. Land first, always land first. About 100,000 acres. The number sits there like a throne, not a poem. A claim. 70,000 owned outright. 30,000 held under government lease. Words like fee simple and term and renewal doing their silent work. The ranch exists on the page as property. It exists in the world as a gate and chain. The island exists as the space inside the margins. Then the cattle, not faces, head. A ranch foreman stands with a tally sheet while the pens fill. You hear the groan of boards, the dull thud of hooves, the occasional bellow, less anger than complaint. The sound of an animal realizing it has been moved again for reasons it will never understand. The Paniolo move among them with practiced quiet. They do not waste motion. They carry rope and patience and a kind of calm violence, the ability to turn a living creature's will with a twist of wrist and a pressure of knee. You can smell hide and manure and dust kicked up into a warm haze that settles on sweat and turns it gritty. One man calls numbers, another marks them, a slash for steers, a dot for heifers, a notation for a limp, a missing ear, a brand that doesn't match clean. The ledger will not record the way the animals look at you. The ledger will not record the way a horse's ribs rise and fall after a long drive, or how a young hand's palms bleed through his gloves. The ledger does not record fatigue, it records loss. A head missing is a dollar missing. A pound lost is a profit thinned. A drought is not a suffering, it is an expense. This is the part the myths don't tell you. The ranch is held together by men whose names never make it into the incorporation papers. The work is not romantic. It is repetitive and it is hot. It is loading salt blocks. It is mending fence in the sun until the wire burns your fingers. It is clearing kiawe thorns out of a horse's fetlock. It is driving cattle down a road that only exists because someone else decided it should, and always behind it, the paper. A ranch this big needs boundaries, and boundaries mean survey lines. Not the old lines, the ones people kept in their heads, the ones defined by ridges and stories and where your uncle used to set nets. New lines, measured lines, lines in chains and feet, hammered into the earth with posts and marked on maps that travel farther than any cow ever will. The land becomes rectangles and irregular polygons. It becomes parcel A and parcel B. It becomes something you can mortgage. In 1900, the Hawaiian Organic Act makes Hawaii a U.S. territory, and with that comes a deeper, harder confidence in the machinery of American property law. The island is now more legible to mainland capital, more searchable, more enforceable. The old idea that land is a responsibility doesn't vanish, but it gets crowded into the corners of a world increasingly run by stamps and titles and courts. So the ranch learns to speak that language fluently. It learns to treat the shoreline as an asset, not a commons. It learns to treat roads as controlled access. A gate is not just a gate. A gate is leverage. A gait is the ability to decide whether a fisherman reaches a traditional spot or turns around in dust with his hands empty. A gait is a policy, made physical, chain across a road. That's a sentence written in metal. And inside the office, the island continues to shrink into numbers. There are figures for equipment, pumps, and piping and repairs from last season's flood damage. There are figures for feed. How many sacks brought over by boat, how many pounds gone in a month. There are figures for labor, men paid for days worked, not for years endured. The books do not list who left because the wage wasn't enough to keep a family fed. They just list turnover, as if men are parts in a machine. Outside, the workers drink water warmed in canteens, and the salt on their skin dries white. They speak softly, conserving breath. The dust sticks to their shins. A horse shifts and snorts and flies away with its tail, and that tail is like a metronome keeping time for a life that repeats itself day after day. A ranch can make a man ancient before his hair turns gray. And then, because a ranch this large is never satisfied with being merely a ranch, other papers appear. Prospect papers, development papers, sugar papers. The ranch company has already flirted with plantation dreams, incorporating the American Sugar Company Limited in 1898, trying to pull fresh water from a coastal plain that tastes the ocean too easily. Even in the early days, you can feel how the ledger pulls the story away from cattle and toward something bigger and hungrier. Cattle are slow money. Land itself is faster, and transforming land, subdividing, leasing, promising future yield, faster still. So the island becomes a set of possibilities, not realities. Possibilities, the most dangerous kind. In the ranch office, a man runs his finger down the page and pauses at the line where expenses rise and revenue lags. He stares at it as if it's an insult. Outside, the sun keeps climbing, indifferent to columns, indifferent to ambition. The land doesn't care if you need the numbers to work. The land does not care what you promised investors in Honolulu. It will give what it gives and withhold what it withholds. But men who believe in paper do not like being told no by dirt and wind. That is when they begin to look for shortcuts, for deals, for leverage that isn't earned by sweat, for the one bold move that might flip the ledger back into the black, might turn hardship into opportunity, might turn a place into profit. And when that moment comes, when the first real temptation presents itself, will it be the stroke of luck they've been waiting for? Or the first sin they'll spend a century pretending they never committed? They'll tell you the first sin was greed. They'll tell you it was a land grab, pure and simple, outsiders rolling up with paper and taking what wasn't theirs. A clean villain story you can spit into the dirt and be done with. But the truth is meaner than that. The first sin wasn't taking the land. The land had already been turned into a thing that could be taken back in 1848, when the great Mahele taught Hawaii the grammar of ownership, title, deed, transfer, inheritance, words that don't rot, words that don't feel shame. No, the first sin was more intimate. The first sin was believing the island would keep giving after you'd begun to squeeze it. You can hear it in the way the early managers talked about Molokai, like it was a patient animal, like it would accept the bit and the spur and pull the load without complaint, as long as you fed it just enough to keep it standing. They had their numbers lined up like fence posts. Roughly 70,000 acres bought outright in 1897. Another 30,000 acres taken under government lease. Call it 100,000 acres of possibility. A kingdom measured in paper. On the ground, the kingdom was rock and thorn and heat. The West End in late summer has a kind of glare that feels personal. The light comes down as if someone is pressing a hot coin against the back of your neck. You walk out across pasture, and the grass is brittle, whispering under your boots. And the wind is full of salt that's traveled miles to get here. You can see cattle spread thin across the land, dark shapes in a pale world, heads down, ribs faintly visible when they turn sideways. The animals don't look heroic. They look patient. They look like they've learned not to expect mercy. And the men working them, Paniolo with rawhide rope coiled at the saddle, hands browned by sun, shirts stuck to their backs, move with the calm of people who know the land, can hurt you without trying. They are not the ones deciding the ranch's future. They are the ones making it possible for any future to exist at all. In Honolulu, in rooms where the air is thick and still, the future is decided with pens. By February 2, 1898, the transfer is formal, the paperwork clean enough to satisfy the kind of men who think cleanliness is virtue. By April 20, 1898, machinery comes across the channel, iron and pipe and casing, and the whole loud faith of modern industry, because cattle are slow money, and the era is drunk on sugar. Sugar is the mainland's favorite sermon. Take a field, add water, harvest profit. Repeat until the map looks different. But Molokai is not Oahu. Molokai is stingy with fresh water in the places they want it most. The island has its own stubborn arithmetic. So they drill. They drive steel into the earth and listen for the sound that means they've found what they came for. 2 wells, about 40 feet apart, cut down 80 to 90 feet, sleeved with an 8-inch casing. When the first water comes up, it's like a miracle in a metal pipe. Cool on the hand, clear in the light, the kind of thing that makes men believe in destiny. They plant 80 acres of seed cane and water it like you'd water a newborn, carefully, anxiously, watching for signs of life. And for a little while, luck shows its face. One shallow well holds steady enough that it can be pumped at roughly 1,000 gallons a day without immediately turning foul. That number, 1 million, does something to a man's imagination. It makes him bold. It makes him careless. It makes him start planning beyond his supply. It makes him see not a fragile pocket of fresh water, but an endless vein. This is how the sin begins, not its cruelty, but as confidence. The confidence spreads the way heat spreads, quietly, inevitably. More fields prepared, more equipment ordered, more men hired to cut and clear and lay pipe under a sun that does not forgive mistakes. You can picture them out there, shirts open at the throat, forearms slick with sweat and grit, hands black with grease from the pump fittings. The machinery clanks and hisses. Steam breathes out of valves. The pump's rhythm becomes a kind of prayer, pull, push, lifting the island's blood into channels cut by strangers, and then the island answers, not with lightning, not with drama, with salt. A deeper well turns brackish after only 2 days of hard pumping, as if the ocean itself has leaned in and whispered, "You're too close." Another begins to taste wrong. They keep at it anyway because the ledger does not accept the word enough. The ledger wants more. By 1899, they bring in a specialist, Michael M. O'Shaughnessy, a geohydrologist from San Francisco, because when faith starts to falter, men hire science to bless the enterprise. A Worthington steam-driven pump gets installed, a serious piece of equipment meant for serious extraction. It sits there on its foundation like a small engine of conquest, bolted down against vibration, ready to convert water into profit. And now the days begin to stack up in a new rhythm. Drilling, pumping, measuring salinity, arguing, patching leaks, drilling again. 5 wells go dry, not gradually, not politely, dry like a throat in the desert. Salinity readings swing like a needle searching for a lie it can settle on. A flash flood caves in pump wells, water arriving in the wrong way at the wrong time, carrying mud and stones that do not care how much the equipment cost. Men dig the machinery out with shovels and curses, their boots sinking in silt, their shoulders burning. They remove parts, reinstall parts, tighten bolts until knuckles split. Somewhere, a foreman barks orders with a voice already hoarse from dust. And all the while, the ranch still has to be a ranch. Cattle still need salt and water, fences still break, horses still throw shoes, men still wake before dawn to do work that will never be recorded in the minutes of a board meeting. The island's ordinary hardships keep running in the background like a low drum. Then comes the paper that changes the tone in the room. On May 29, 1900, O'Shaughnessy puts his warnings into writing. Correspondence that doesn't read like poetry and isn't meant to. It reads like a man trying to save other men from their own ambition. The wells, he argues, are laid out wrong. They're pulling too hard, too close to the sea. They're inviting saltwater intrusion, the ocean's slow revenge. He condemns the recklessness, the faith-based engineering, the assumption that the island will tolerate whatever is asked of it. And now you can see the pivotal moment clear as a blade. Picture the office again, the fan chopping warm air, the table cluttered with maps and figures, a glass of water sweating on a coaster, leaving a ring that looks like a small shoreline. Men in shirt sleeves leaning over papers, their foreheads damp, their collars stained. Someone reads the letter aloud. Someone else drums his fingers on the wood. In the pause afterward, you can feel 2 futures hanging in the room. One future says, pull back, accept limits, let the ranch be a ranch. The other future says, press harder, redesign, spend more. Take the island by the throat and make it yield. And here's where the first sin becomes visible, not as an act, but as a choice. Because they do not choose restraint. Restraint does not build empires. Restraint does not satisfy investors. Restraint does not make a man feel larger than his own life. They choose to keep pushing, to treat the warning as a problem to be solved rather than a boundary to be respected. That choice does not look evil in the moment. It looks practical. It looks like determination. It looks like modernity. But the island hears it differently. The island hears it as the sound of men deciding that nature will be corrected. And luck, whatever luck is, does not always punish you immediately. Sometimes luck lets you get away with it just long enough to make the habit permanent. The shallow well holds longer than it should. The cane grows enough to justify more planning. The cattle still ship. The ranch continues. The ledger keeps breathing. So the ranch survives its first warning. It absorbs its first compromise. It learns that you can force the island at least for a while and still call it stewardship. And when survival starts to look like success, when endurance begins to feel like triumph, what happens next? When the numbers finally swell and the money comes in and the ranch steps into its so-called golden age, who exactly will that prosperity feed? They say the golden age came in like sunlight. that once the papers were signed and the fences strung and the pumps bolted down, prosperity just walked in the front door, boots clean, hands open, carrying work for everyone. But the truth is, the golden age arrived as a set of numbers that finally behaved. It's a morning on the West End, sometime after the island has been folded into American law in 1900. After men in Washington have done what they always do, turned a place into a jurisdiction, a people into a population, a coastline into a line item. The ranch office sits low against the heat, wood warped in places, windows half open to a wind that can't decide if it wants to cool you or sandblast you. A fan turns in the corner with a sound like an old engine trying to remember how to run. Flies tick the glass. The air smells of paper, sweat, and the faint, sour hint of manure carried in on boots. A clerk lays a ledger open like a body on a table. The book is heavy. The pages are thick and slightly rough, meant to take abuse. There are old water stains on the margins from someone's spilled cup, and pencil marks that never quite erased. Ghost math still haunting the paper. He sets a blotter nearby. He wets the tip of his pencil with his tongue, an old habit, half superstition, and begins to write. First, land. The number is the same one that keeps echoing through everything on this island. 100,000 acres under one corporate will, a private empire made of about 70,000 acres owned outright and 30,000 acres leased from government. On the ground, it's gulches, ridgelines, brackish flats, and pasture that look soft until you walk it and feel the rock under every step. On paper, it's a single entry. It fits on one line. That's the first seduction of accounting. It makes conquest look tidy. Then, water. The clerk notes the pumping figures from the Molokai wells, numbers that had once felt like salvation. That shallow well that held long enough to make men bold. The one that could be drawn down at roughly 1,000 gallons a day without immediately tasting like the sea. 1,000,000. That word sits in a man's mind like a shot of whiskey. It warms him. It makes him careless. It makes him believe the island is a machine that can be worked harder if you just tighten the bolts. The letter from the San Francisco hydrologist, May 29, 1900, the date burned into the office memory, still exists in a file drawer. The warning is still there, folded and refolded, the creases smudged by hands that keep returning to it like a bruise you press to see if it still hurts. Salt intrusion, bad layout. Pump too hard and the ocean will come for its due. Every man in this office has read it. Not everyone believes it. Belief is optional when you have investors. Then, cattle. Outside, the day is already moving. You can hear it through the boards. A gate slam, a horse snort, the dull metallic ring of a bucket dropped on hard ground. The pens are full of heat. Cattle stand shoulder to shoulder, their hides twitching with flies, eyes half lidded against sun and stress. The smell is thick, animal breath and warm hide, and the sweet rot of manure that is baked into the dirt. Men move along the rails, pañuelo with rope at their hips, bandanas pulled up over their mouths, hands steady and quiet. They count without drama because drama wastes energy. They tap a post, call a number, mark it down, and move on. The animals aren't stock to the men who handle them. Their weight and temperament, danger and routine. But by the time that count reaches the desk, it becomes just that, stock. The clerk writes head and a number beside it. He writes weights. He writes losses, a calf dead in the night, a steer gone lame, a fence broken during a squall. Every problem gets translated into the only language the ledger speaks: cost. And then, this is where the golden age truly begins. He writes revenue. He writes the proceeds from beef and hides, from whatever the ranch can ship out across the channel. He writes it in dollars that do not carry any smell. In the accounting, a man's sweat has no odor. A horse's strain leaves no mark. An island's patience does not appear anywhere on the page. The arithmetic begins to line up in a way it hasn't before. A few years earlier, the island's assessed value had lurched like a sick animal, around $250,000 in the late 1890s, and then swelling toward $680,000 by 1900, numbers ballooning with sugar fever and mainland confidence, then threatening to collapse again when water and reality refused to cooperate. Those valuations weren't just abstract. They were permission. They were leverage. They were the difference between a bank manager saying yes or leaning back in his chair and saying, not on those terms. And here, on this morning, the clerk is building terms. He totals columns with the slow patience of a man who knows mistakes have consequences. He uses a stub of pencil worn down to the wood. He does sums twice. You can see sweat beading along his hairline, not from exertion, but from responsibility. A bad carry on a number can ruin a month. A bad month can ruin a year. A ruined year can mean wage cuts, layoffs, families going hungry, in a place where hunger has nowhere to migrate to. The ranch manager comes in without knocking. He smells of leather and tobacco, of sun. He looks down at the page and doesn't ask about the men mending fence or the cattle coughing in the pens. He asks about the numbers, because numbers are what travel to Honolulu. Numbers are what soothe shareholders. Numbers are what make men in suits believe they understand an island they've never walked. The manager points at an expense line: repairs, replacements, the constant bleeding of equipment that rusts in salt air. He points at water costs, at pump maintenance, at the scars left by that flood that caved in wells and swallowed machinery. He doesn't say the ocean is pushing back. He says operational challenges, because the ledger likes euphemism. The ledger likes anything that sounds manageable. Outside, the workforce keeps moving. Someone drags a length of wire. Someone carries a sack of feed. A horse stands in the shade of a kiawe and flicks its tail like a metronome, keeping time for a life that is mostly work. A cook behind the bunkhouse stirs a pot, steam rising with the smell of salt meat and onions. Men eat standing up because sitting down takes too long. The ranch runs on those small efficiencies, the kind you never see in a board report. And gradually, quietly, the ranch becomes more than cattle. The land itself begins to take on an additional meaning. Not just grazing, not just production. Land becomes collateral. Land becomes potential. Land becomes the thing you don't sell because it is the source of all the other deals. It becomes the quiet power to grant access or deny it, to allow a road or close one, to smile at a proposal or choke it in its cradle. This is what a golden age looks like in real time. Not champagne, not parades, just a ledger that finally tells a story investors like. The clerk closes the book with both hands as if sealing something alive inside it. The cover makes a dry sound like a coffin lid. The manager takes the totals and folds them into a letter that will go to Honolulu, where someone will read them in an office that smells of polished wood and imported coffee instead of dust and cattle. And on that paper, the ranch becomes impressive. It becomes disciplined. It becomes inevitable. But if you stand outside long enough, if you let the wind bring you the smell of the pins and the sound of the chain on the gate, you start to understand what that golden age really is. A moment when power begins to feel natural to the people holding it. And once power starts to feel natural, once the numbers start to look like destiny, what stops the owners from believing they aren't merely businessmen at the edge of an island? What stops them from believing they are something closer to royalty? They say the owners were like kings, not kings in the old sense with bloodline and obligation, but kings in the new American sense, men with acreage, men with access, men who could nod once and make roads appear or disappear. They say the ranch was governed by steady hands, that it was guided by a paternal calm, that the people on Molokai could look up at the big house, the office, the gate, and know someone is minding the store. But the truth is, the royal feeling wasn't born from nobility. It was born from distance. Power always looks cleaner from far away. In the years after annexation, after the Newlands Resolution of July 7, 1898, after Hawaii is pulled into the American orbit with a stroke that never asked the islands for consent, the old forms of authority don't vanish. They just get replaced by something that wears a friendlier face. The monarchy is gone, and with it the clarity of who rules and who is ruled. In its place comes a kingdom of paperwork, corporations, boards, trustees, territorial administrators. It's quieter, it's more polite, it can smile while it takes. Then in 1900, the Hawaiian Organic Act makes the new order official. The island becomes a territory, a jurisdiction, a set of statutes. The kind of transformation that feels abstract until it hits you where you live, in the courtroom, in the tax office, at the gate, in the way a man with a badge can suddenly tell you where you can't stand anymore. And the ranch, sitting on roughly 100,000 acres of Molokai, learns to inhabit that new world like it was built for it. On paper, the ranch is a business. In practice, it can start to feel like a government. Picture the morning routine, not in the pasture but in the office. A clerk arrives before the heat turns cruel. He opens the shutters and lets in a thin breeze that smells of dust and salt. He sets the day's mail on the desk, envelopes with Honolulu postmarks, thick paper that means lawyers, thinner paper that means invoices, and the occasional official-looking notice that carries the weight of the territory itself. He sharpens a pencil down to a point fine enough to hurt. He checks the keys to gates, keys to sheds, keys to a filing cabinet where land becomes folders. A ranch hand can spend all day under the sun and never touch the true center of power on this island. The true center of power is a lock. In the yard, men are already moving, horses shifting, snorting, saddles being cinched down, leather creaking, the smell of sweat and tack oil mixing with the sweetness of dry grass. Somewhere, a cook is laying out food that will be eaten fast and mostly without conversation, because conversation takes breath, and breath is precious when the day is long. The workforce is the machinery that makes the ranch real. The owners, whoever they are at any given moment, are mostly ghosts. They exist in signatures. They exist in directives. They exist in the way wages are set and how quickly a man is replaced if he complains. That's the deconstruction right there. If you want it plain, the ranch's royalty is not made of extraordinary men. It's made of ordinary power, applied consistently over time until it feels like fate. And because it feels like fate, it begins to be performed. A visiting party arrives from Honolulu, men in pressed shirts, women in dresses that don't belong in dust, camera cases and polite laughter. They stand in the shade and admire the view the way people admire an expensive painting. Someone brings leis, because that is what you do when you want to sanctify a transaction with softness. A manager walks them through the operation with the practiced language of reassurance. He speaks of heritage. He speaks of stewardship. He speaks of opportunity, words that sound noble until you examine who gets to define them. The visitors step out to look at cattle, and the cattle look back with the dull, ancient patience of animals that have seen thousands of humans come and go. A breeze lifts dust into the air, and it settles on polished shoes. Someone laughs nervously. The manager laughs too, as if dust is charming, as if hardship is part of the aesthetic. And there it is, the ranch as performance. The ranch isn't just producing beef anymore. It's producing a story about itself. A story in which the owners are caretakers, the managers are wise stewards, the island is grateful, and the labor is an unspoken detail. A story in which power is not coercion, but responsibility. But the island keeps its own record. A fisherman comes up to a gate and finds it locked where it wasn't locked before. He stands there with his gear in his hands, the wind pushing against his shirt, and he stares at the chain like it's a personal insult. He doesn't call it policy. He calls it what it is, a barrier, a decision made by someone he will never meet. A family drives down a road they've used for years and is turned back by a sign. Not a man with a gun, just a sign. That's how the new royalty likes to rule, without blood, without spectacle, just with the quiet authority of posted rules. And every time the ranch exercises that authority, it teaches the island a lesson. The ranch is not merely a workplace. It is an institution, a private state with its own borders. Then, decades later, statehood comes. August 24, 1959, the Hawaii Admission Act made flesh, and people talk about a new era, new rights, new representation, a modern Hawaii stepping into the American story as an equal. But the ranch still sits there on the same land, with the same gates, the same access points, the same power to make a yes feel like a gift and a no feel like law. That's the royal illusion in its purest form, a private enterprise that begins to feel like a public authority, simply because it is large enough and old enough to outlast the people who question it. And the owners, far away, protected by layers of management and distance, begin to believe their own myth. They begin to believe they are not just holding land. They are embodying destiny. They are the rightful hand on the tiller. They are the island's future, whether the island asked for them or not. But the more you play king, the more you start to crave a court. You start to crave admiration. You start to crave an audience. You start to wonder what else the land can do besides graze cattle and balance books, what else it can perform, what else it can sell. So here's the turn of the knife. Once the ranch has dressed itself up as stewardship, once it has learned to speak in the soft language of noblesse oblige, what stops it from turning the island itself into a stage, polished, packaged, and priced for outsiders to come watch? They say it was the tourists who saved it. They say the ranch looked out at the future and saw the old cattle math wasn't going to carry it forever, so it did what smart outfits do. It adapted. They say it opened its arms, let visitors in, let money flow, let the island breathe. But the truth is, the land didn't open its arms. It was put on display. After August 21st, 1959, when Hawaii became a state, the mainland's imagination did what it always does when something becomes official. It rushed in. The brochures got glossier. The flights got cheaper. The word paradise started showing up in places it didn't belong. Bank ads, real estate pamphlets, hotel stationery, and Molokai, quiet, stubborn, inconvenient, became newly interesting to people who loved the idea of untouched places, so long as someone else would build the path to reach them. On the ranch side of the island, the day still started the same. Horses sweating under saddle, men cinching leather tight, dust lifting off the road like smoke. But there was a new sound in the air, faint at first and then unavoidable, the chop of rotor blades. A helicopter comes in low over the scrub, the wind from it flattening kiawe branches and throwing grit in your eyes. It lands in a clearing like it owns the ground, because that's what machines do. They arrive with the confidence of money. The doors open and a man steps out wearing city shoes and sunglasses, hair combed for air conditioning. He pauses as if he expects the island to greet him. A manager walks up and shakes his hand. That handshake is the beginning of the performance. They walk him along a fence line. They show him cattle, because cattle look like authenticity to outsiders. They show him the ocean glittering beyond the pasture, because the ocean is the hook. They talk about view sheds and amenities and low impact, phrases that sound like restraint while they are actually requests for permission. In the office, the show gets more precise. A map is unrolled across a table, not the old kind with ridges and gulches described in story. The new kind, color-coded, gridded, measured, the island reduced to blocks that can be assigned a use. Someone points to a stretch of shoreline and calls it underutilized. Someone points to pasture and says potential. Someone draws a box with a pencil and with that small motion begins to change people's lives. This is where the ranch becomes a stage, because development isn't just bulldozers. Development is a narrative you sell first. You sell it to regulators, to bankers, to the public, and most importantly, to yourself. You tell yourself you're bringing jobs. You tell yourself you're providing opportunity. You tell yourself you're saving the place by modernizing it. And the more you repeat it, the more it starts to feel like morality instead of business. But a place like Molokai doesn't exist as a blank canvas. It's already full of graves, full of fishing spots, full of routes that exist in memory even if they don't exist on county maps. The ranch may control about 100,000 acres, but the island is not empty inside those lines. It is inhabited by history. It is inhabited by obligation. It is inhabited by people who remember when access wasn't something you requested. And when the ranch begins to treat the land as scenery, when it starts talking like a resort brochure, the local ear hears something else. It hears the old American trick. Take a living place and turn it into a commodity. Then call the transaction progress. By the time the environmental era arrives, by the time NEPA takes effect in 1970, by the time the Clean Water Act arrives in 1972, by the time the Endangered Species Act becomes law in 1973, the ranch's stagecraft has new obstacles. Paperwork gets thicker, permits multiply. Environmental review becomes a phrase that can stall a dream for years, and the ranch learns another kind of performance, how to speak the language of protection while still pursuing profit. A consultant arrives with binders. heavy binders, white spines, black print, tabs sticking out like little flags. He sets them on the table with a thud that sounds like seriousness. Inside, the island becomes data again. Species lists, water flow estimates, traffic projections. The consultant points at a chart and speaks in the calm tone of someone paid to make disruption sound orderly. Outside, the wind keeps doing what it has always done, pushing salt inland, drying the skin of leaves, making the pasture smell like sun-baked iron, and on the far side of the ranch, the coastline sits there with its long beaches, miles of sand that tourists call empty, as if emptiness is a virtue, as if empty doesn't just mean unowned by them. The ranch begins to imagine controlled access as part of the product. A gate isn't just a barrier anymore. It's exclusivity. It's branding. It's the difference between public and private. Words that sound neutral until you realize one means belonging and the other means permission. You can't sell the idea of an untouched island if everyone can touch it. The paradox of paradise is that it must be protected from the very people you're inviting to come enjoy it. So the ranch tries to thread a needle. It tries to be local and corporate at the same time. It tries to be heritage and future at the same time. It tries to keep the Paniolo image, dust, rope, cattle, while also courting the kind of money that prefers golf greens and cocktail napkins and controlled views. And the invisible workforce gets asked to carry that contradiction. The ranch hands still mend fence, still move cattle, still work under the same sun. But now they also watch strangers stand on overlooks and take pictures, watch consultants step around mud like it might stain their resumes, watch the island get described by people who don't speak to it. They hear their home called a hidden gem. They hear it called an opportunity. They hear it called a destination. And every time something in the blood tightens, because the stage requires an audience, and audiences come with demands. They want comfort. They want access. They want the island to be authentic, but not inconvenient. They want culture as decoration. They want history in a gift shop. They want the rough edges sanded down. The ranch, chasing bigger revenue than cattle could ever reliably provide, starts making choices that look small in a board packet and look enormous on the ground. Where to allow a road, where to restrict one, which shoreline becomes managed, which pasture becomes special use, which promises get spoken aloud, and which ones stay buried in the fine print. And all of this is happening while the world outside Molokai is changing its own rules. Markets rising and falling, regulations tightening, the cost of fuel shifting, the appetite of tourists swelling and then shrinking with each recession and shock. So here's the question that hangs at the end of this chapter like dust in late light. When an old ranch starts dressing the land like a stage and calling it survival, what happens when the wider world changes again? When the economy turns, the laws tighten, the money gets nervous, and the ranch finds out it cannot keep performing forever? They say it all fell apart in a day. One announcement, one slammed door, one last truck rolling out the gate, and that was that. They say the ranch died like a man shot in the street, sudden, noisy, clean enough that you can point to the moment and call it fate. But the truth is, it didn't die in a day. It bled out in slow motion while the world around it kept changing clothes. On March 24, 2008, the air in the lodge carries that stale sweetness of brewed coffee that's been sitting too long on a warmer. The kind of coffee poured by habit, not hope. The ceiling fans turn and don't help much. Outside, the palms barely move, and the sun has that sharp, indifferent brightness you get on Molokai when the wind takes a pause. People gather in a room that was meant for visitors, tourists with cameras, honeymooners with sunburns. But today, it's staff, locals, workers, the ones who keep the place running when no one's looking. They stand in clusters, not speaking much. Someone's shoes squeak on tile. A chair scrapes. A man clears his throat and it sounds like gravel. You can see it on faces before any words are spoken. The tightness behind the eyes, the way the jaw sets like a latch. People know when bad news is coming because bad news has a smell, paper and sweat and a kind of polite hesitation. Then it said, plain as a bill collector. Operations will shut down at the end of March. More than 120 people will be laid off. The reason given isn't drought or disease or cattle prices. It's unacceptable delays and continued opposition to the company's master plan, language that makes the island sound like an obstruction and the corporation sound like a victim. The words land in the room like a dropped tool, heavy, final. A woman folds her arms tight, like she's holding her ribs in place. A man stares down at the carpet as if there's a crack there he can fall into. Someone whispers a name. Maybe a son, maybe a mortgage, maybe a cousin who already left for Maui because there wasn't enough work here. In a place this small, job loss is never just job loss. It's a tremor that travels through households, through trucks, through school lunch money, through the quiet calculations people do at night when they can't sleep. Outside, the island keeps breathing. The ocean doesn't change its mind. The wind returns and drags salt across the parking lot. Birds keep fussing in the trees. And the ranch, this institution that has worn so many faces, has just told its own workers that the show is over. But if you want to understand that moment, you have to understand what came before it, not as a neat timeline, but as a slow tightening. Go back to 1987. That's a date that matters because it's one of those quiet corporate dates where ownership changes hands without the land moving an inch. Molokai Ranch, by then roughly 52,000 acres in scale under that corporate identity, ends up with Brierley Investments as sole stockholder, an outside entity, an investor logic, a different kind of patience. Not the patience of a ranch hand watching weather, the patience of capital watching returns. That's the first shift you can feel even if you don't read the filings. The ranch becomes less like a place and more like an asset class. The land is still red dirt and Kiawe thorn. The cattle still cough dust. But the decision-making moves farther away from the smell of manure and closer to the smell of conference rooms. Then comes December 1st, 2000, and a piece of financial truth slips out in public. The value of the holdings gets written down. More than $150 million shaved off the book value. That's not romance. That's not heritage. That's a corporation admitting, in the only language it trusts, that the dream didn't match the numbers. And the numbers, those numbers, don't punish the people in suits first. They punish the people in boots. Because when the ledger gets nervous, it starts looking for new stories to tell. Cattle are steady but not glamorous. Tourism has higher margins but sharper teeth. Real estate is the great American seduction. Turn land into parcels, turn parcels into promises, turn promises into cash. So the ranch keeps reaching for a future that can justify itself. By 2005, ownership shifts again, this time to a foreign investment arm tied to resort and leisure capital, the kind of ownership that sees land as a platform for development. Around this period, the ranch is described as holding on the order of 55,000 to 60,000 acres, a third of the island in practical terms. Depending on how you count and which parcels you include, the exact number doesn't matter as much as the feeling it creates. If one company controls that much ground, it doesn't just participate in Molokai's economy, it defines it. And with that new ownership comes a plan with a number attached to it like a hook. 200 luxury homes proposed for La'au Point. 200. Say it slowly and you can hear what it means. Water demands, road demands, service demands, the quiet shift of an island center of gravity. Luxury homes don't just bring residents. They bring expectations. They bring the mainland's appetite for control dressed up as amenities. You can see how the pitch would be made. A glossy rendering, blue ocean, green fairways, the word sustainable printed in clean font. Jobs promised, tax revenue implied, a future described as inevitable, and in some boardroom somewhere, it all looks so reasonable. But Molokai is not a blank market. Molokai is an island with memory, and memory is a form of resistance. On the ground, what people see isn't a rendering. They see a gate. They see access tightening. They see water being discussed like a commodity instead of a lifeline. They see outsiders arriving with clipboards talking about capacity and infrastructure as if the island's main purpose is to hold up someone else's dream. And here's the part outsiders rarely understand until it costs them. Opposition on Molokai doesn't always look like a riot. It can look like stubbornness, like delay, like endless questions asked in public meetings, like elders sitting in folding chairs under fluorescent lights and refusing to be rushed. It can look like someone saying again and again, no, in a tone so calm it drives developers insane. By November 2007, the tension is public enough that money starts floating in strange ways. Pledges and counter-pledges, talk of buying the ranch outright, talk of stopping the development by purchasing the land itself. The island becomes not just a community, but a contested balance sheet. And then, in March 2008, the company chooses its own kind of weapon. It shuts down. It takes the jobs in the lodge and the restaurant and the tours, the daily economic bloodstream, and pinches it off. It tells the island, if you won't let us build the future we want, then you can live without the present we provide. That's the coldest kind of power because it wears the mask of practicality. Purely business, they say, as if business is not a moral act, as if business doesn't decide who eats and who leaves. When the announcement is over, people drift out into the sunlight, blinking like they've been underwater. Some go quiet, some get angry, some go straight to their trucks and sit there with hands on the wheel, not turning the key, just staring at the windshield because their mind is trying to do math that doesn't come out clean. And somewhere beyond the parking lot, beyond the last manicured edge of the resort grounds, the ranch land stretches out, wide, silent, indifferent, still there, still locked behind gates, still held under ownership that can change without the island's consent. So the world changes. Ownership, economics, the language of development, and the ranch tries to keep playing the same game. Control the land, control the future, outweight the people. But what happens when the people decide they can outweight the ranch? When resistance stops being a shout and becomes a discipline, a long, steady refusal practiced in meeting halls and kitchen tables? What does revolt look like when the weapon is not a gun, but a chair pulled up to a folding table and the word no said without raising your voice? They say the revolt was a tantrum, a handful of loud voices anti-everything, clinging to a past that can't pay the electric bill. They say it was sentimental, locals afraid of change, afraid of outsiders, afraid of the future. They say the ranch was offering jobs and investment, and the island answered with stubbornness, like a mule refusing to cross a stream. But the truth is, the revolt didn't look like a revolt, because Molokai doesn't waste energy on theater. Molokai learned long ago that the loudest man in the room is usually the least dangerous. The dangerous one is the person who takes notes. The dangerous one is the auntie who brings a folder. The dangerous one is the uncle who sits through 5 hours of testimony without shifting in his chair, waiting for his 2 minutes at the microphone the way a hunter waits for a break in the brush. You want to see it? Then come into the room. It's evening, and the building is one of those public places that all look the same across America. Low ceiling, fluorescent light that makes everyone look tired, scuffed linoleum, a faint smell of mop water and old paper, folding chairs set in rows, a long table up front where officials sit like they're trying not to be there, a microphone that squeals when it first turns on, like it resents being asked to carry human truth. Outside, the trade wind moves through the trees, and the night air is cool enough to make you notice how sweaty your shirt got during the day. Inside, people fan themselves with agendas printed on cheap white paper. The agenda is the first weapon. It tells you what will be allowed to exist in this room, which topics get time, which don't. It's a small tyranny, and everyone here knows it. A man stands at the doorway counting heads the way a ranch foreman counts cattle, not because he wants to, but because numbers matter. If only 10 show up, they'll say the community doesn't care. If 100 show up, they'll call it a mob. The sweet spot is steady, enough to be undeniable, calm enough to be unimpeachable. They are here for land. They are here for a plan. They are here because the ranch, holding something like 55,000 acres, a third of the island in practical terms, has begun to talk about the future in a way that sounds, to these people, like eviction dressed as opportunity. And because the ranch has already shown its hand. 200 luxury homes at Layout Point? An idea that looks like a neat number on a proposal and looks like a slow invasion when you live on a rock in the ocean where water is finite and everybody is related. The first speaker is a company representative. He wears the uniform of credibility, tucked shirt, calm tone, a smile that never reaches the eyes. He says jobs. He says community benefits. He says sustainability. He says partner. He speaks like the island is a stakeholder in a project instead of a place with a pulse. He presents the development like a gift. He does not say the other number out loud, that once you build luxury, luxury demands more luxury. Roads, power, security, water systems, service staff, a secondary economy that starts as opportunity and ends as dependence. Then the microphone turns to the community, and you can feel the room change the way you can feel weather shift before rain. An elder goes up first, slow steps, no drama. She holds her paper like it weighs something. She doesn't shout. She doesn't insult. She speaks in a voice that has carried families through worse than this. She says the land is not empty. She names places the way you name relatives. She talks about shoreline access, about gates and chains, and how private becomes a habit that spreads. She talks about burial sites without making it sentimental, because it isn't sentiment, it's obligation. A younger man goes next. He's angry, but he keeps it leashed. He talks about water. He doesn't need an engineering degree to know the math. You cannot add hundreds of new high-demand homes on an island that already knows drought. He talks about the ranch shutting down operations, March 24, 2008, the date still raw, and how that felt like a threat. He doesn't call it blackmail, but the word hovers in the room like smoke. A woman stands and talks about jobs, not as an abstract promise, but as a lived wound. She says her cousin lost work in the shutdown. Over 120 people laid off, just like that. She says people want to work. People want to stay. But they don't want to be made into servants in their own home. She doesn't say colonization. She doesn't have to. Everyone here understands the shape of it, and that is the revolt. Not one speech, but a sequence. Testimony like rainfall, steady, cumulative, impossible to dismiss without revealing what you are. Between speakers, there are long pauses while officials shuffle papers. Those pauses are where the island does its most important work. In the silence, you can hear the breathing. You can hear the little clicks of pens. You can hear someone's stomach growl because dinner was hours ago, and they came anyway. This is what resistance looks like when it is grown up. Tired people choosing to be present. And outside the room, this part matters. There's a different kind of organizing happening. Someone is building a phone tree. Someone is printing flyers. Someone is coordinating rides for elders who don't drive at night. Someone is calling relatives on Oahu and Maui, telling them to show up, to send letters, to stop treating Molokai like a quiet backwater and start treating it like the front line it is. A teenager is learning how to speak at a microphone without shaking. A fisherman is learning the vocabulary of permits and hearings because he has realized that the new battlefield is paperwork. Because that's what the ranch counted on. That the community would get bored, that they would get tired, that they would miss a meeting, that the developers' patience, fueled by money, would outlast the island's patience, fueled by love. But Molokai has a different kind of endurance. The island knows how to wait. Week after week, meeting after meeting, the same faces show up, the same calm refusal, the same insistence that progress has to answer to the people who live on the land, not just the people who own it on paper. And gradually, the ranch's performance starts to fail, because you can sell paradise to strangers, but you cannot sell it to the people who already know it. You cannot convince them the land is underutilized when they've watched it feed families for generations. You cannot tell them access will be maintained when they've seen chains go up and never come down. You cannot tell them jobs when they've already lived through what jobs can be used as a lever pulled by someone else. So the revolt remains quiet, and that quiet becomes a problem for the ranch. Quiet is harder to discredit. Quiet doesn't give you a villain. Quiet looks to outsiders like reason. And that is what makes the next move inevitable. Because if the ranch can't win the island with persuasion, and it can't outlast it with patience, then it has only one tool left, the tool it has always had. The deed, the shutdown, the ability to say, fine, if we can't have our future, you can't have your present. So when the refusal holds, when the room keeps filling, when the questions keep coming, When the word no becomes a discipline instead of a reaction, what does a private kingdom do when it realizes it can't rule the way it used to? Does it bend and change? Or does it break and take everyone down with it? They say the old order died because it was out of touch. A corporation too stubborn to listen. A management class too proud to bend. They say it deserved what it got. That the island finally threw it off like a bad saddle, and the ranch, humiliated, simply collapsed. But the truth is, the old order didn't die from humiliation. It died the way old power always dies in America, in a conference room under fluorescent light, with a calculator and a lawyer and a decision that can be justified in a single sentence. It is late March of 2008, and the wind has that thin edge to it that makes you feel the bones of the island under the skin. The lodge is still open, technically. The sign is still up. The rooms still have linens folded tight enough to look untouched, but everybody working there is moving like people at a wake, quiet, careful, speaking in the half phrases, because saying the full thing out loud makes it real. In the kitchen, a man runs water over his hands longer than he needs to, letting it cool his wrists. He stares at the sink, as if the stainless steel might tell him what comes next. A woman counts inventory on a clipboard. Coffee packets, sugar, paper napkins, because even in grief, you still do the math you were trained to do. The smell of cleaning solution hangs in the air, sharp and false, the scent of reset that never really resets anything. Up front, the manager has a stack of envelopes, final pay, instructions, a list of benefits that will end on a date written in ink like a verdict. He reads from a prepared statement the way men do when they're trying to keep their voice from shaking. The words are corporate and clean. End of operations. Effective immediately. Due to circumstances beyond our control. The language is designed to make a choice sound like weather, but it was a choice. It was a choice made after years of the ranch trying to reinvent itself as something more profitable than cattle, something that could justify the land not as pasture, but as promise. A promise measured in units and lots and glossy renderings, a promise that, when the island refused it, turned sour. The ranch had been living in the long shadow of numbers for a while. In December 2000, the books took a public blow. More than $150,000 written down, value erased on paper with the casual cruelty of a pencil stroke. That wasn't a ranch problem. That was a capital problem. That was investors realizing the story they'd been sold, paradise as a predictable return, didn't hold up against salt water and community resistance and the simple fact that islands have limits. Then came the development pitch, the one with a clean headline number you could carry into a meeting like a trophy. 200 luxury homes at Lau Point. 200, not 5, not 20, 200, a number big enough to change the island's metabolism. A number big enough to make the people who already lived there feel the ground shifting under their feet. And when the resistance held, when the hearings filled, when the questions got sharper, when no stopped being a complaint and started being a discipline, the old order reached for the oldest tool it had left. It shut the doors. On March 24, 2008, the announcement had already been made. Operations closing by the end of the month, more than 120 workers laid off. And now the end of the month arrives like a slow tide. There is no single dramatic moment, no gunshot, no fire, just a steady withdrawal. You can hear it in small sounds. A key ring tossed onto a desk. metal clinking against metal, the sound of access being surrendered, or depending on how you hear it, being consolidated. A file drawer shut for the last time. The thin rasp of cardboard as someone tapes up a box of office supplies that will be shipped off island. Tape pulled fast makes a ripping sound like cloth tearing. In the lobby, a guest asks if the tours are still running. The staff member answers politely, the way service workers do even when they're bleeding inside, and says no, not anymore. The guest nods, confused as if the island has broken a promise it never made. Outside, the ranch land is still there, tens of thousands of acres, still behind gates, still held under title that can change hands without anyone on Molokai voting on it. The pasture doesn't go anywhere. The coastline doesn't dissolve. The cattle don't vanish in a puff of sentiment. The physical empire remains. It is the social contract that dies, because the old order wasn't just about employment. It was about a particular arrangement of power, the ranch as provider, the island as dependent, the owners as distant authority. That arrangement has a smell to it, like damp canvas and old leather, because it belongs to a century when company towns were normal and gratitude was expected. Now, in 2008, that arrangement hits the wall of a new reality, a community unwilling to be managed like a line item. And the ranch, this private kingdom, discovers a brutal truth of its own. If you rule by being the primary employer, your throne is made of payroll. When the payroll stops, the throne becomes just a chair in an empty room. The workers feel it first. A man in a faded cap walks out carrying his last box. Family photos, a mug, a pair of gloves, stiff with old sweat. He loads it into the bed of his truck with slow care, as if being gentle can keep the moment from turning ugly. He closes the tailgate and stands there with his hands resting on the metal, staring out toward the road. The road is sun-bleached. The dust sits in the air like a held breath. A woman locks a door she has unlocked every morning for years. The key turns with a small click that feels too final for such a small sound. She pockets the key anyway, then stops, realizes it isn't hers, and pulls it back out. There is a moment of hesitation, like grief has caused a short circuit in the brain, and then she walks it back inside and leaves it where she was told to leave it. The act is tiny. The meaning is enormous. This is the death of the old order, the moment the ranch stops being a lived relationship, however unequal, however resentful, and becomes only a legal fact. And legal facts are cold things. They do not feed you, they do not teach your children, they do not fix your truck when it dies. They sit in file cabinets and court records and corporate registries. They persist without love. If you listen closely, you can hear another sound beneath the closing doors and the taped boxes. It is the sound of ownership preparing to shed a skin. Because in America, when an institution like this dies, it rarely disappears. It changes its name. It changes its structure. It moves the pieces around and calls it strategy. So here is what hangs in the air after the last shift ends and the last key is turned in. When a ranch empire collapses as a provider, but survives as a deed, what does it become next? What new mask does it put on to keep the land, the leverage, and the story alive? They say reinvention is a choice, a bold pivot, a bright idea in a bright room, a man in a clean shirt standing at a whiteboard, drawing arrows into the future like the future is listening. But the truth is, reinvention is what you do when the old story stops paying for itself. In the weeks after March 24th, 2008, the ranch is a body that hasn't yet learned it's dead. The gates are still there. The roads still run through pasture the same way they always have. That long, sun-bleached ribbon cutting between Kiawe and Rock Wall. The lodge still stands with its windows dark and its curtains pulled, like a house whose owners left in a hurry and told themselves they'd be back before anyone noticed. But the place doesn't sound the same. No laughter from tourists on the lanai, no clink of glasses, no voice over a radio calling out tour times. The silence is so complete you can hear things you never heard before. The slight creak of a sign in the wind, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft tick of gravel under your boot as you walk across a parking lot that used to be full. A few workers remain, not as employees in the old sense, but as caretakers. The kind of people you keep around when you don't want your assets to rot. They move through the buildings, turning off breakers, shutting water valves, draining lines so pipes won't split. They inventory what's left, mattresses, sheets, kitchen equipment, office computers, not because they care about towels, but because in a corporate death, everything becomes salvage. The layoffs, more than 120, aren't a statistic here. They're faces you recognize at the store. They're trucks that stop showing up at dawn. They're kids whose parents suddenly get quiet at dinner. And in Honolulu, and farther away than Honolulu, the numbers begin to speak louder than the land. This is where reinvention really happens, not on the island, but in the language that travels, in memos and phone calls and board packets and legal pads covered in small math. The ranch has already learned the hard way that it can't live forever as a cattle outfit. It can't live forever as a resort either, not when the community won't bless the expansion. It has already taken its wound in the books. More than $150,000 written down in December 2000, a confession made in accounting language admitting the dream had gotten ahead of the ground. So now the ranch does what cornered institutions do. It tries to become something that can survive without asking permission. Not morally. Legally, there's a difference. The first reinvention is rhetorical. It starts with a new set of words. They stop saying resort so loudly. Resort sounds invasive now. Resort sounds like the thing that got rejected. They start saying low impact. They start saying eco. They start saying sustainable again, because sustainable is a word that makes people feel guilty for doubting you. They start saying partnership, because partnership implies consent, even when the power is unequal. They have to sell a story that sounds smaller than what they wanted. But the land they control is still huge, on the order of 55,000 acres, give or take, a third of an island that has no room to be casual about numbers like that. They can't make the acreage disappear, so they try to change what the acreage means. A man sits in an office somewhere with a real estate broker on speakerphone. The broker's voice is smooth, practiced, the voice of someone who calls land inventory without shame. He asks the questions that matter in that world. What's the zoning? What's the water situation? What's the political risk? He doesn't say, is the community going to fight you? He says risk. He doesn't say, are there burial sites? He says constraints. And in that one shift of language, you can feel the whole reinvention take shape. The ranch isn't trying to be loved, it's trying to be bankable. A package gets assembled, a prospectus maybe, a thick binder or a PDF that turns an island's west end into bullet points. Acreage, shoreline, views, existing infrastructure, untapped potential. They might mention that earlier proposal, 200 luxury homes at La'au Point, not to revive it exactly, but to prove the land can carry a dream big enough to attract serious money. They'll call it entitlement potential. They'll say it like a promise with no blood on it, and the binder will not contain the smell of dust. It will not contain the memory of a meeting hall full of elders saying no. It will not contain the fact that the shutdown itself felt, to many locals, like a threat delivered in the only language the ranch believed would work: pain. The second reinvention is operational, quiet, almost petty. They cut anything that looks like a service, because service makes you accountable to people. Service requires smiles and open doors. Service creates witnesses. The ranch doesn't want witnesses right now. It wants flexibility. So it becomes more closed, more guarded, fewer people inside the gate, security patrols, signs, locks changed. The posture shifts from welcome to managed. The land returns to what it always was beneath the tourism costume: controlled space. And still, the bills don't stop. Land doesn't pay for itself just because it's beautiful. Taxes come, maintenance comes, insurance comes. The wind keeps peeling paint off structures you're trying to mothball. Salt keeps eating metal. And every month that passes is a silent question asked by the ledger: what are you now, if you're not employing the island and you're not building your dream? That question pushes the ranch toward the third reinvention, the most American one of all: unbundling. You don't save the whole thing. You carve pieces off. You find ways to extract value without carrying the burden of the entire story. And this is where you start to hear new conversations. Less about ranching, less about hospitality, more about parcels, leases, easements, rights of way, strategic partnerships, ways to monetize without committing, ways to profit without inviting the public back in, because reinvention isn't a redemption. It's a survival strategy. And survival strategies, when they're driven by capital, tend to get colder with time, not warmer. They tend to move from big dreams to small extractions, from grand plans to quiet deals signed in rooms where no one on Molokai is present. So the ranch sits there, tens of thousands of acres, gates locked, buildings quiet, trying to shed its skin again, trying to become an asset that can move through the world without the island's consent. And when that's the direction of travel, when reinvention starts to look like disassembly, you have to ask the next question straight. Does this legacy survive by staying whole and changing its face, or by selling the dream one piece at a time and leasing the soul along the way? They say the land never really leaves, that even when a company collapses, even when the lodge goes dark and the payroll stops, the ground stays right where it is, patient, unmovable, like it's immune to human schemes. But the truth is, land leaves all the time. It leaves in rectangles, in parcels, in easements, in a line of type that says grantor and grantee, and in that small swap of names, the future gets reassigned. The dirt doesn't walk away, no, but control does. Access does. The right to decide does. And those are the only things that ever mattered in the first place. After March 24, 2008, when the ranch announced it would shut down operations and lay off more than 120 people, the island's air changed. Not the wind. The wind stayed the same: salt, dry grass, distant ocean. It was the human air that changed. Conversations got quieter. People started talking in half sentences at the store, in the parking lot, at the post office. Because When a big landholder goes dark, you don't just lose jobs, you lose certainty. And in that vacuum, rumors breed like flies. You'd hear it the way you hear distant thunder, low, indistinct, but building. They're going to sell. Not the whole thing, maybe, not at once, but sell. Break it up, peel pieces off. Find buyers who don't need to be loved, only secured. And that is how the real estate mind works. It does not think in home. It thinks in exit. In an office with air conditioning cold enough to make your arms prickle, a broker lays out a map, the kind printed on the glossy paper that smells faintly of toner and hot plastic. He smooths it with the flat of his palm like he's calming an animal. The map is colored, segmented, full of neat borders that look authoritative only because they are clean. He taps a section near the coast with the cap of his pen and says the word that makes investors lean forward. Frontage. He does not say shoreline access. He says ocean views. He does not say cultural sites. He says constraints. He does not say community opposition. He says political headwinds. He smiles as he says it because euphemism is a kind of tradecraft. Somewhere in the margins of this conversation sits a number that always turns human lives into abstractions. About 55,000 acres, give or take, a third of Molokai in practical terms, a size that doesn't just represent opportunity, it represents power. A holding so large that you can alter the island's future simply by deciding what not to do with it. The broker's phone is on speaker. There's a voice from somewhere else, mainland maybe, or Honolulu, smooth and unhurried. The voice asks about entitlements, about pathways, about timelines. The broker answers in the same language, and you can hear the machinery turning. If this land can't be developed into the big dream, it can still be turned into smaller dreams. Dreams that don't need public hearings. Dreams that don't require the island to consent. Dreams that can be bought quietly and held quietly and sold quietly later when the world forgets to be angry. This is not new. The ranch has been flirting with the idea for years, even when it still wore the costume of hospitality. That earlier pitch, 200 luxury homes at Lael Point, still sits in the corporate memory like a blueprint rolled up in a tube. It proved something important to money. The land can be imagined into a product. Even if that product was rejected, the act of proposing it taught the landholder how to speak to investors. It taught them how to sell the idea of Molokai without selling the truth of Molokai. And the truth is heavy. The truth has meetings attached to it. The truth has people who show up and refuse to leave. The truth is inconvenient. So the reinvention becomes smaller and colder. A lease here, an easement there, a temporary access agreement that becomes permanent by inertia, a concession, a special use permit. Terms negotiated in rooms far from the dust, written down with careful clauses that anticipate trouble, land as puzzle pieces. You can see it happening in the paperwork itself. A lawyer flips through documents with fingertips slightly stained by ink. The pages whisper as they turn. He pauses to underline a phrase, successors and assigns, because that phrase is the bridge by which power travels through time. He drafts language that doesn't mention the island's name, only the property. Because names are human. Property is legal. Property can be moved. And outside that office on Molokai, people feel the shift before they can prove it. A fisherman hears that a certain road might change. Not closed outright, just managed. A family hears that the land near a beach might be sold to a private party. A hunter hears that access to a ridge might require permission. And suddenly, old habits, walking, fishing, gathering, begin to feel like they could become privileges if you don't defend them. It's not dramatic. That's the point. The drama is what corporations fear because drama draws attention. The real trick is the slow transfer, death by paperwork. Someone on Molokai goes to the bureau where records live, not because they trust rumors, but because they've learned that if you want truth in a modern land fight, you go to the documents. They request filings. They read legal descriptions full of bearings and distances, so many feet, so many degrees, language that sounds like navigation and functions like conquest. They look for dates, they look for names, they look for anything that suggests the land is already being carved. The cursed part of it isn't superstition. The cursed part is how ordinary it is. Back in December 2000, when the ranch's owners wrote down more than $150,000 in value, that was a signal flare, an admission that the old story was failing. Once value collapses on paper, the pressure begins. Boards want answers, investors want exits, and exits in the American way usually mean liquidation. Not selling the whole beast, because a beast that big attracts scrutiny. You sell it in cuts, and each cut has its own story. Conservation, agriculture, private recreation, investment holding. Words that can be true and still be weapons, because the outcome is the same. The land passes into fewer hands, farther away, harder to reach. On the island, the shutdown already felt like a threat. Work pulled away as leverage. Now the possible sell-off feels like a second blade. The land itself being used as collateral against the people who live around it. It's one thing to lose a job. It's another thing to lose the last quiet certainty that the place won't be subdivided out from under you. And yet even here you can feel a strange steadiness rising. Not hope, not optimism, something older, a recognition. Because Molokai has always understood the bargain of America. If you don't watch the paper will rewrite you. So the island begins to listen harder, to count, to show up, to ask who is buying and what buyer really means. Because a buyer doesn't just purchase land. A buyer purchases the right to define what the land is for. And that is the hinge the story swings on now, right here, in the quiet season after the shutdown, when the ranch is most tempted to sell the dream in pieces and lease the soul in fine print. Will the island let the land be broken down into silent transactions? Or will Molokai, small, patient, stubborn, find a way to make even the paperwork tremble? They say the island won because the company got tired, that capital lost interest, that the ranch simply miscalculated, packed up its toys, and left. Like the people of Molokai were spectators to their own fate, lucky passengers on a storm that happened to blow the right direction. But the truth is, the island didn't get lucky. The island got disciplined. On Molokai, fighting back doesn't usually look like fire. It looks like fluorescent light and a sign-in sheet. It looks like a folding table with a coffee urn that's been reheated too many times. The smell of burnt grounds hanging over the room like a warning. It looks like aunties with notebooks and uncles with calloused hands and young people learning right there in real time how to turn anger into procedure. It's not a rally. It's not a riot. It's a meeting. The room is warm even at night. trade wind coming through half-open jalousie windows, carrying salt and the faint sweetness of plumeria from somewhere outside, mixing with the odor of paper and plastic chairs. Somebody has a stack of printed agendas, thick enough to make a sound when they hit the table. The sound is small, but everyone hears it. The sound says, "We are doing this for real." This is after March 24th, 2008, after the ranch says it's shutting down operations. After the words, "more than 120 workers laid off," start traveling through the island like an illness. The shutdown has already done its work. It has frightened people. It has bruised families. It has also clarified something the island had been trying not to say out loud for years. Dependency is a leash, and the hand holding it can tighten whenever it wants. So the island gathers, not to beg, not to bargain, but to decide how to live without letting the leash become a collar. A man stands and reads the situation the way you'd read weather. He doesn't romanticize it. He says the ranch holds something like 55,000 acres, give or take, depending on how you count. But everybody in the room knows what that really means. It's not just acreage, it's shoreline, it's access roads. It's the difference between a place being yours in practice or yours only in memory. Someone else brings up the plan again, the clean, arrogant number that won't die. 200 luxury homes at Laiao Point. 200, a number that sounds like a catalog order, a number that would require water and power and roads and services, which is another word for turning locals into staff in someone else's paradise. The room doesn't explode. That's what surprises outsiders. The room doesn't explode because Molokai understands something the mainland forgets. Rage burns fast. Organization burns slow. An auntie raises her hand and speaks in that calm tone people use when they're trying not to let emotion be used against them. She talks about gates. About how the ranch has always controlled access like a private government, chains and locks and signs that turn home into permission. She says it plain. If the land gets carved up and sold, access won't get easier. It will get harder. The island will become a set of little kingdoms, each with its own lock. A younger voice speaks next. Somebody who has lived long enough to know the economy is a knife, but not long enough to accept that as destiny. He says jobs matter. He says people are hurting. Then he says the sentence that lands like a rock in a tin bucket. Jobs that require you to surrender the island are not jobs. They're ransom. You can feel the room breathe around that. A few heads nod. A few eyes close for a second, not in prayer, but in recognition. Because that is the tightrope. How do you feed your family without selling the ground they will stand on? This is where the island strategy shows itself, not in slogans, in logistics. Someone has a list of phone numbers. Someone is coordinating rides for elders who don't drive at night. Someone has printed copies of public comment deadlines and handed them out like ammunition. Someone is teaching a teenager how to speak at the microphone without trembling, how to state their name, their connection, their objection, and then stop, so no one can twist their words into hysteria. Because the island has learned the modern battlefield is paperwork. You can't just love a place. In America, you have to document that love. You have to put it into the approved forms. So they do it. They show up where decisions are made, in county meetings, in hearings, in any room where the ranch's plans need a stamp. They ask for the environmental review. They ask for the water plan. They ask who will pay for infrastructure. They ask what Public benefit means when the public can't afford the product being built. They ask and ask and ask, until asking becomes a kind of fence line the developers can't cross without bleeding. And you can see the effect in the people on the other side of the table. The company reps still smile, but the smile gets thinner. They start using phrases like good faith and moving forward and timeline, words meant to hurry an island that refuses to be hurried. They say the island is anti-development, and the island replies, steady as a hammer, no, we are anti-being sold. Somewhere in all this, the ranch thinks it still has leverage. It thinks the shutdown, March 2008, the loss of those 120 jobs, will make the island bend. That pain will soften resistance, but the opposite happens. The shutdown removes the ranch's claim to moral authority. It reveals the relationship for what it is: conditional, transactional, a private empire offering survival, so long as the island accepts its terms. So the island stops arguing on the ranch's turf. It stops trying to be liked by capital. It starts acting like a community defending its body. There's a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when you realize who is actually building the future. It isn't the men with ownership papers. It's the woman making copies at her own expense. It's the guy with grease under his nails, staying up past midnight, reading permit language because he refuses to be tricked by a phrase. It's the elders sitting through hours of testimony because they know endurance is a weapon. It's the invisible workforce again. Except now the work isn't mending fence. It's mending a boundary between what can be bought and what cannot. The island isn't naive. People still need money. People still need jobs. The world doesn't stop being the world. But there is a difference between needing work and surrendering the right to remain yourself. That difference is what Molokai put on the table, and capital, big, confident capital, has a weakness most folks don't want to admit. It needs consent, or at least the appearance of it. It needs the story to be clean enough to sell. When the story becomes ugly, when the friendly aisle refuses to smile on command, money starts looking for easier ground. Money loves resistance only when it can brand it. So the island keeps saying no, keeps showing up, keeps making the paperwork tremble, and eventually the great lesson crawls out into the open where nobody can pretend not to see it. You can hold 55,000 acres in your name. You can promise 200 luxury homes. You can lay off 120 workers to prove you're serious and still lose if the place you're trying to own refuses to be owned in the only way that matters. So now, with the ranch's masks slipping and the island's refusal hardened into habit, we arrive at the last question, the one that doesn't belong only to Molokai. If a small, patient community can stare down a private empire and make it blink, what does that say about the American bargain itself? And what does it demand from the rest of us watching? They'll tell you the story ends when the company backs down, when the plans collapse, when the lodge goes dark and the glossy renderings get rolled up and shoved into a drawer like a bad map. They'll tell you that's justice, that's victory, a clean ending you can clap for. The little island beats the big money, the people win, the curtain drops. But the truth is, there is no curtain. There is only the land, and the land doesn't end stories. It keeps them. An island is not a page. You can't turn it and move on. What Molokai taught, quietly, stubbornly, without fireworks, is not that power disappears. It's that power changes costumes. It learns new words. It hires better lawyers. It learns to speak in the language of concern while it keeps doing the math of control. And the community, if it wants to remain itself, has to become fluent too. Not in slogans, but in the slow grammar of modern conquest. Permits, easements, hearings, filings, access rules, stakeholders, public benefit, mitigation. The soft words that can be sharpened into knives. America loves a myth where the land is empty and the future is for whoever shows up with the most ambition. We love it because it flatters us. It tells us the world is a fair fight and the winners are simply the brave. But Molokai does not flatter. Molokai sits out there in the channel and watches people repeat the same mistake, confusing ownership with belonging, confusing a deed with legitimacy, confusing profit with purpose. Because if you listen to the numbers, if you let the cold facts do their work, you can see what this story really was. Not a feud, not a personality clash, an economic pressure system. Ranching alone couldn't hold the ledger steady forever. Tourism looked like salvation until it started demanding the island's silence as a price of entry. Real estate was the ultimate temptation. Turn land into lots, turn lots into wealth, turn wealth into permanence. And then the island refused the deal. Not because the island hated money, but because the island understood the nature of that money. It wasn't just dollars. It was a new order, a new hierarchy, a new set of people who would arrive expecting the island to rearrange itself around their comfort. So Molokai did what small places are often told they can't do. It made itself inconvenient to conquer. And that is the part that should unsettle you, if you're honest. Because it means the story isn't locals versus outsiders or progress versus tradition. That's the cheap version, the version used to sell both sides their favorite lie. The real story is older and simpler. Land is finite, and the appetite of capital is not. When those two meet, something has to give. Usually it's the people. Usually it's access. Usually it's dignity. Usually it's the kind of quiet life that doesn't show up on a balance sheet. But here, for a time, it wasn't. The island's victory, if you want to call it that, was not a triumphal march. It was a discipline practiced in fluorescent-lit rooms. It was elders enduring meetings that lasted too long. It was parents choosing to be present when they were tired. It was young people learning to speak in public without being baited into rage. It was the invisible workforce again. Except this time, they weren't building an empire. They were keeping one from being built on their backs. And in that discipline, there is something that feels un-American in the best possible way. A refusal to treat land as merely a commodity. A refusal to let the future be drafted by strangers who can leave whenever the numbers stop behaving. You can admire the capability of the people who built the ranch, because it takes competence to run cattle on dry ground, to string fence across rock, to keep machinery alive in salt air, to balance books when weather and market both want to ruin you. You can admire their nerve, their organizational mind, their stamina, and you can still see the cost. You can see the gates, the chains, the signage that turns a road into a question. You can see the way jobs were used as a lever. You can see the way the land was spoken about as though it were waiting to be improved, as though it had no story until a corporation gave it one. That's the great man illusion in a Hawaiian suit. The belief that one owner's vision is the island's destiny. Molokai refused that illusion, not with hatred, with patience, and patience is a weapon the modern world is not built to withstand. Because modern capital needs speed. It needs compliance. It needs a clean narrative. It needs you either grateful or angry. Anything but steady. Molokai stayed steady. Molokai made no sound like weather. And the empire, for all its acreage, found itself without the one resource it could not buy: consent. So now, if you pull back far enough, the ranch becomes what it always was beneath the branding, a lesson in American reach. How far ambition can extend before it finds a boundary it can't easily bulldoze. How a place can be called friendly while being asked to surrender. How a myth can be sold to visitors while the people living inside it carry the weight. And as you pull back farther, past the pasture, past the roads, past the dry west end and the green cliffs and the white line of surf, you come back to the simplest image in this whole story: a gate, a chain, a padlock warm from the sun, not hot, just warm enough that you feel it in your palm and understand, without anyone explaining it, what it means when land becomes permission. You stand there again, tasting salt in the air, hearing the small clink of metal as wind tests the links, watching dust lift and settle like an old memory that refuses to leave. And the island sits beyond it, quiet as ever. Quiet the way a living thing can be quiet when it has survived a long time and expects to survive longer than you. So tell me, when you hear this story, when you picture the lock and the land and the promises made in conference rooms, what did you call truth? And whose legacy did you decide to carry?